A man built like a freight train had already stepped inside the estate long before anyone realized death had crossed the front gate. The security monitor flashed green. The biometric scanner approved his credentials without hesitation. Cameras tracked him for less than a second before automatically moving to the next scheduled sweep, leaving behind nothing more than the image of an oversized delivery contractor pushing a heavy equipment case across polished stone. To everyone watching, he was another anonymous worker arriving on another ordinary morning. Only the silence around him felt wrong. Every step echoed with impossible patience, as though he already knew exactly where every hallway led and exactly how many seconds remained before he reached his destination. Inside the Romano estate, preparations continued as if the world outside were perfectly safe. Staff hurried through kitchens carrying silver trays. Gardeners trimmed immaculate hedges beneath the warm spring sun. Senior advisors gathered inside the East Conference Room, where Adrian Romano, 37 years old and feared by rivals across the East Coast, prepared for a private strategy meeting that would determine the future of his organization. Expensive watches ticked. Crystal glasses reflected golden morning light. Nobody noticed that one security officer briefly frowned at the delivery manifest before dismissing the strange feeling and returning to his phone. Nobody noticed that the visitor's boots carried no dust despite arriving from a construction company supposedly working across town. Nobody except fate itself, quietly waiting in the corridor. The enormous stranger never hurried. He paused once beneath a marble staircase, studying a framed family portrait with calm blue eyes that revealed neither anger nor excitement. His expression remained almost peaceful, making him even more unsettling. He looked less like someone searching for trouble and more like someone completing a task that had already been decided weeks ago. Somewhere beyond those walls sat one of the most protected men in America. Somewhere beyond those walls stood dozens of trained professionals whose only purpose was ensuring Adrian Romano survived another day. Yet the giant continued walking with complete confidence, as though every layer of protection had already failed before he even arrived. Upstairs, polished shoes crossed expensive hardwood floors while conversations about investments, shipping routes, and charitable foundations blended into the quiet rhythm of a mansion built on discipline. Outside the conference room, guards exchanged routine jokes. Inside, Adrian reviewed documents with the same icy composure that had earned him both loyalty and fear. He had overcome betrayals, hostile negotiations, and impossible odds throughout his life. Experience had taught him that danger usually announced itself with loud voices, rushed footsteps, or desperate mistakes. This danger announced itself with perfect manners and flawless paperwork. Somewhere between the front entrance and the eastern hallway, an invisible countdown had already begun. 10 minutes before everything changed. 9 minutes before every carefully rehearsed security protocol would be tested. 8 minutes before the entire estate would discover that confidence could become blindness. The nightmare had already entered the building wearing an employee badge, carrying a harmless smile, and leaving behind almost no reason for suspicion. In a mansion filled with powerful people, experienced guards, advanced surveillance systems, and endless rules, not one of them understood that the person most capable of changing what happened next had not yet even been introduced. She was simply a rookie Maid beginning her very first morning, unnoticed by everyone who believed greatness always arrived wearing a tailored suit instead of a simple black uniform. Grace Carter had imagined her first day would be difficult, but not because she feared making mistakes. She feared becoming invisible. At 23 years old, she had already learned that people often looked through women like her before they ever looked at them. She arrived at the Romano estate 45 minutes early wearing a neatly pressed black uniform that still carried the crisp folds from its packaging. Her shoes were polished until they reflected the morning light, even though they had been purchased from a discount store only 2 days earlier. She carried everything she owned inside a canvas backpack that rested quietly beside the employee entrance while she waited for someone to unlock the service door. The mansion towered above her with limestone walls, towering columns, and windows that seemed large enough to belong in a museum rather than a private residence. Grace took one slow breath before stepping inside, reminding herself that this job was never about luxury. It was about keeping a promise. 6 months earlier, she had stood beside her mother's hospital bed, promising that no matter how difficult life became, she would never stop moving forward. That promise had carried her through temporary jobs, overnight shifts, and countless interviews that ended with polite smiles and disappointing phone calls. When the Romano estate finally offered her a position, she accepted without asking questions. She only knew that the paycheck could change everything. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the head housekeeper, greeted her with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades managing impossible schedules. She explained every hallway, every cleaning supply, every rule, and every expectation without wasting a single word. Never interrupt a meeting. Never enter the West office unless instructed. Never touch personal documents. Never speak unless spoken to inside the conference wing. Grace listened carefully, repeating every instruction until Mrs. Brooks gave one small, approving nod. The older woman believed discipline could be taught, but attitude could not, and there was something quietly determined about the young maid standing before her. Even so, the rest of the staff barely noticed Grace. Experienced employees rushed past carrying fresh linens, breakfast trays, and laundry carts without learning her name. One cook called her sweetheart. Another called her new girl. A security officer asked whether she was lost before realizing she worked there. None of it surprised her. She smiled anyway because kindness cost nothing. As she polished a brass railing overlooking the grand foyer, Grace found herself watching the rhythm of the estate, rather than the people themselves. Delivery schedules arrived within minutes of one another. Maintenance workers always greeted each guard before passing security. Garden staff entered through the south gate carrying green identification badges clipped to the left side of their shirts. Every movement seemed organized, almost musical, yet tiny details rarely escaped her attention. Her late father had worked as a city firefighter for nearly 30 years, and he often reminded her that emergencies rarely began with loud alarms. They began with one small detail that everyone else ignored. Grace never forgot those lessons. While dusting a console table near the eastern hallway, she glanced toward the entrance just as an unusually large contractor slowly rolled a heavy equipment case across the marble floor. Nobody reacted. Guards offered routine greetings before returning to their conversations. Office assistants walked around him without hesitation. Even the reception clerk smiled politely before looking back at her computer. Grace lowered her feather duster for only a second, unable to explain why an uncomfortable feeling settled quietly in her chest. She could not identify a single broken rule. She only sensed that one note inside the mansion's perfect rhythm suddenly sounded different. Grace watched the enormous contractor disappear beyond the eastern corridor until the polished equipment case vanished around a corner reserved for maintenance crews. She tried to return to her assignment, but her hands moved more slowly than before. Something refused to settle inside her mind. She had spent years trusting small instincts because life had taught her that obvious danger was rare. Real trouble usually arrived disguised as routine. Before she could think further, Mrs. Eleanor Brooks called her name from across the foyer and handed her a fresh polishing cloth. The conference room windows needed attention before the executive meeting officially began. Grace nodded immediately and walked toward the second floor, careful not to leave fingerprints on the gleaming brass handrail. The upper hallway overlooked the estate's central atrium, where morning sunlight poured through a massive glass ceiling and covered the marble floor below with warm golden light. It was beautiful enough to distract almost anyone. Grace noticed that nobody looked upward. Everyone kept their attention on schedules, phones, and responsibilities. The mansion functioned like an expensive clock whose gears had turned the same way for years. At the end of the corridor stood two security officers outside a pair of walnut doors. They greeted arriving advisors with quiet respect before opening the entrance one guest at a time. Through the narrow opening, Grace caught her first glimpse of Adrian Romano. He was not speaking when she first saw him. He simply stood beside the long conference table reviewing several folders while morning light framed the sharp lines of his charcoal suit. There was nothing theatrical about him. His confidence came from complete stillness rather than loud authority. The room naturally adjusted itself around his presence. Conversations paused until he finished reading. Chairs remained empty until he took his seat. Even experienced executives seemed careful with every word they chose. Grace understood immediately why people described him as powerful without ever raising their voices. He carried himself like someone who expected discipline because he practiced it every day himself. One advisor quietly mentioned a delayed shipment. Adrian responded without irritation, asking only for facts instead of excuses. Another presented financial reports for several charitable foundations supported by the Romano family. Adrian studied every page before approving additional funding for community food programs and scholarships. Grace found herself surprised. Rumors often painted powerful men with only one color, yet reality rarely fit inside simple stories. Before the doors closed again, Adrian briefly thanked one elderly employee for 30 years of loyal service and wished him a happy anniversary with genuine sincerity. It lasted only a few seconds, but Grace noticed the older man's eyes brighten with quiet pride. Then the meeting resumed, and the hallway returned to silence. Grace continued cleaning the tall windows outside the conference room, while security personnel remained focused on the entrance. Nobody questioned the unusual contractor who had already entered the building minutes earlier. Nobody questioned why one scheduled maintenance request no longer appeared on the digital workboard. Nobody questioned why the oversized equipment case required no assistance despite its apparent weight. Grace gently wiped another section of glass before stopping again. Across the atrium, she spotted the same contractor moving through a restricted hallway that ordinary maintenance crews almost never used during executive meetings. He did not appear lost. He walked with calm certainty, as though he had memorized every turn long before arriving. Grace felt the uncomfortable pressure return to her chest. She looked toward the nearest security officer, then back toward the disappearing figure. Around her, expensive clocks continued measuring another ordinary morning. Only Grace sensed that time itself had begun moving much faster than anyone realized. Grace lowered the polishing cloth and quietly stepped away from the conference wing before anyone noticed she had stopped working. She told herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps the maintenance schedule had changed. Perhaps the contractor had received special clearance. Yet every instinct refused to let the questions disappear. Her father used to say that when something felt out of place, the first mistake was convincing yourself that someone else had already checked it. Grace reached the service hallway overlooking the restricted corridor and pretended to dust an antique display cabinet. From there she watched without being noticed. The giant stopped beside an emergency exit, not to open it, but to study the reflection inside its narrow glass panel. He was not admiring himself. He was checking what stood behind him without turning his head. Seconds later, he adjusted the position of the large equipment case by only a few inches before continuing forward with measured confidence. Grace frowned. Every maintenance employee she had passed that morning had greeted staff members by name, exchanged casual conversation, or asked for directions. This man never spoke to anyone. He acknowledged every greeting with a polite nod, but never offered a single unnecessary word. His silence felt practiced rather than natural. She noticed another detail. Every employee badge inside the estate displayed tiny signs of daily use. Corners became worn. Plastic collected faint scratches. Lanyards twisted from months of movement. The contractor's identification card looked perfectly new, perfectly centered, perfectly clean. It looked like something prepared for today rather than something carried every day. Grace felt her pulse quicken. She carefully followed from a distance, keeping one hallway between them whenever possible. The mansion seemed unusually quiet as the executive meeting continued upstairs. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished floors, while a grandfather clock softly marked another passing minute. The peaceful atmosphere somehow made the stranger appear even more unsettling. He reached another security checkpoint where a guard glanced at a digital tablet before stepping aside without hesitation. The contractor thanked him politely and continued walking. Grace stopped beside a decorative column just as the guard returned to his post. "Excuse me," she said with a respectful smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am still learning the building. Was there another maintenance project scheduled today?" The guard barely looked up. "Plumbing inspection," he answered. "It was approved yesterday." Grace thanked him, but the answer only deepened her concern. The equipment case carried the logo of an electrical company, not a plumbing contractor. It was a small difference, almost impossible to notice unless someone happened to spend an entire morning watching delivery uniforms move through the estate. Grace remembered helping her father organize emergency equipment during school vacations. He insisted that labels mattered because people trusted them without thinking. Wrong labels created dangerous assumptions. She looked back down the corridor. The contractor had disappeared again. For a brief moment, she considered returning to her assigned duties. She was new. She could easily embarrass herself by reporting. Nothing more than coincidence. If she interrupted the meeting without evidence, she would almost certainly lose the opportunity she had worked so hard to earn. Yet another memory surfaced. Her father smiling beneath his weathered fire helmet after a long shift, telling her that courage rarely felt comfortable. Most of the time it felt exactly like standing alone while everyone else believed everything was fine. Grace slowly folded the polishing cloth into her apron pocket and turned toward the nearest internal security office, unaware that every second she hesitated allowed the silent visitor to move one hallway closer to Adrian Romano. Grace reached the internal security office expecting urgency, but instead she found routine. Two officers monitored rows of surveillance screens, while another reviewed delivery confirmations on a tablet. The quiet hum of computers filled the room. One officer accepted a cup of coffee from a coworker without taking his eyes off the monitors. Everything appeared calm, organized, and completely ordinary. Grace hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I think one of the contractors might be in the wrong area." The nearest officer looked up with mild curiosity rather than concern. "Which contractor?" Grace described the unusually large man and the equipment case with the electrical company logo. She carefully explained that another guard had mentioned a plumbing inspection and that the identification badge looked brand new. The officers exchanged quick glances before one of them smiled politely. "It is his first visit to the estate," he said. "New badges always look new." The work order was approved. "There is nothing to worry about." Grace thanked him, but she remained standing. She knew she sounded inexperienced. She also knew that none of her observations proved anything by themselves. Still, the feeling in her chest refused to disappear. "Could someone verify the company name anyway?" she asked quietly. "It will only take a minute." Another officer shook his head while checking the digital schedule. "We have a meeting upstairs with important guests. We cannot interrupt operations every time someone feels uncertain. You are new here. Focus on your assigned duties and let security handle security." His words were not cruel, only dismissive, and somehow that made them even harder to argue with. Grace nodded respectfully and stepped back into the hallway. She could have walked away. Most people would have. After all, she had done exactly what she believed was right. She had reported her concern to the people responsible. If they chose not to act, the responsibility no longer belonged to her. Yet as she returned toward the conference wing, she noticed another detail that made her stop once again. The digital maintenance board mounted near the service elevator refreshed automatically every 30 seconds. The plumbing inspection listed earlier had disappeared entirely, replaced by a completed status even though the contractor was still somewhere inside the mansion. Grace stared at the screen, then looked down the empty hallway. A maintenance project could not be marked complete if the worker had not left the building. She quickly glanced toward the security office, but laughter drifted through the open doorway as the officers resumed their routine conversation. Upstairs, the executive meeting continued behind closed walnut doors. Advisors discussed contracts. Pens moved across expensive paper. Crystal glasses caught the morning sunlight. The peaceful rhythm of the estate remained unbroken because nobody realized the schedule itself had stopped making sense. Grace slowly turned the corner toward the eastern corridor and caught another brief glimpse of the contractor. He was standing perfectly still near an architectural display, studying the hallway ahead with patient concentration. He was not reading directions or waiting for assistance. He looked like someone measuring distance, counting doors, and memorizing every possible path without ever removing the calm expression from his face. Then, almost imperceptibly, he closed the equipment case, adjusted the strap across his shoulder, and continued forward with quiet confidence. Grace no longer believed she was watching an ordinary employee. She also realized that if everyone else continued trusting paperwork instead of their own eyes, she might soon become the only person left willing to ask the question that nobody else seemed ready to ask. Grace remained hidden beside the service corridor long after the contractor disappeared from sight. Every sensible reason told her to return to work, Yet every lesson her father had ever taught refused to let her walk away. He used to remind her that courage did not begin when people felt confident. It began when they accepted the possibility of being wrong, but chose to protect others anyway. She quietly removed the employee map Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had given every new hire that morning. It showed laundry rooms, supply closets, emergency exits, and maintenance access routes that most visitors never noticed. Her eyes followed the narrow corridors until they reached the restricted mechanical wing running parallel to the executive conference room. If someone wanted to avoid the main hallways without attracting attention, that route offered the shortest path. Grace folded the map, slipped it back into her apron pocket, and headed toward the service staircase. The mansion suddenly felt different. Every polished floor reflected sunlight as beautifully as before, yet the silence carried an unfamiliar weight. The distant sound of conversation drifted from the conference room, where Adrian Romano continued meeting with his advisors, completely unaware that someone inside the estate had quietly abandoned every predictable pattern. Grace reached the maintenance level and noticed another small detail. One fire safety door, which should have closed automatically, stood slightly open. A bright yellow rubber wedge held it in place. Housekeeping procedures never allowed doors like that to remain unsecured because they protected emergency escape routes. She gently removed the wedge and looked down the empty passage. Fresh wheel marks stretched across the smooth concrete floor before disappearing around a corner. They matched the width of the equipment case she had seen earlier. Grace followed the faint tracks without making unnecessary noise. The air became cooler as the hallway narrowed between utility pipes and electrical panels. Everything remained perfectly still until she heard something unexpected. It was not conversation. It was the soft clicking sound of someone opening and closing what seemed to be a detailed floor plan or mechanical diagram. Grace cautiously stepped closer until she reached another intersection. From there, she could see the contractor standing alone before a building maintenance display mounted on the wall. Instead of reading equipment instructions, he carefully compared the display with a folded document taken from inside his case. His eyes moved between emergency exits, ventilation routes, and service elevators with remarkable precision. He looked less like a repair technician and more like someone confirming every possible route through the estate. Grace immediately stepped back before he could notice her reflection in the polished metal panel beside him. Her breathing remained controlled, but her heartbeat quickened. This was no longer about a strange feeling. This was evidence that something inside the mansion was unfolding according to a plan that nobody else seemed to recognize. She reached into her apron pocket for the small radio issued to housekeeping staff earlier that morning. It only connected to maintenance supervisors, not estate security, but it was the fastest way to contact another employee. She pressed the call button. Static answered. She tried again. Nothing. The signal indicator had disappeared completely. Grace frowned and looked toward the ceiling where the communication repeater should have been blinking with a green light. It was dark. Whether it was a technical malfunction or simple coincidence, she could not tell. All she knew was that asking for help had suddenly become much harder. She slowly lowered the silent radio and realized that the distance between the unknown visitor and Adrian Romano had become shorter than ever before, while the number of people who still believed everything was normal continued to grow smaller with every passing minute. Grace slipped away from the maintenance corridor before the stranger could notice her, forcing herself to think instead of panic. Every hallway inside the Romano estate had been designed with purpose, and for the first time that morning, she realized those same hallways could protect people just as easily as they could hide danger. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks had mentioned during orientation that every service employee was expected to memorize emergency evacuation routes before learning luxury housekeeping standards. At the time, Grace thought the lesson seemed excessive. Now it became the only advantage she possessed. She unfolded the employee map once more and studied the narrow passages surrounding the executive conference room. One route led directly past the mechanical wing. Another curved through the wine cellar before connecting to the private elevator reserved for senior staff. If the stranger continued following the most efficient path, he would eventually reach the corridor outside Adrian Romano's meeting. Grace quietly hurried toward a maintenance control station she had noticed earlier that morning. It was a simple wall panel containing fire safety indicators, ventilation controls, and emergency door overrides used only by authorized personnel during inspections. Her father had spent years teaching volunteer safety classes, and although she had never worked in emergency services herself, she remembered one lesson perfectly. Buildings were designed to guide people away from danger through layers of automatic protection. Sometimes buying even a single extra minute could change everything. Grace carefully opened the clear protective cover over the emergency ventilation controls and read every instruction before touching anything. She refused to guess. She searched for the setting that would temporarily seal the maintenance corridor while leaving the conference wing unaffected. A scheduled testing mode appeared on the display, allowing selected fire doors to close automatically for inspection. She pressed the activation button and immediately heard several heavy doors quietly locking into place somewhere behind the walls. No alarm sounded. No panic spread through the mansion. To everyone upstairs, nothing had changed. Down in the service corridors, however, the direct route toward the executive wing had suddenly become much longer. Grace closed the panel, whispered a grateful thank you to her father for lessons he never knew would matter this much, and hurried toward the nearest staircase. As she reached the upper floor, she noticed two security officers speaking into radios with puzzled expressions. One mentioned that a maintenance access door had unexpectedly entered inspection mode. The other suggested contacting facilities after the meeting ended. Neither officer considered that the timing itself might matter. Grace looked toward the eastern hallway and froze. The contractor had reappeared, but instead of showing frustration at the blocked route, he calmly changed direction without hesitation, almost as though he had already prepared an alternate plan. He never argued with security. He never appeared surprised. He simply adjusted the strap on the equipment case and continued walking with the same quiet confidence that had unsettled Grace from the beginning. That calm reaction frightened her more than anything else she had witnessed. It meant the obstacle she created had not ended his plan. It had merely delayed it. Grace understood she could no longer rely on procedures alone. Every minute she gained would disappear unless someone finally believed what she had seen with her own eyes. She straightened her uniform, steadied her breathing, and turned toward the conference entrance, determined that even if nobody listened, Adrian Romano would hear the warning directly before the silent visitor reached him. Grace reached the conference hallway just as two senior advisors stepped outside to answer phone calls. The walnut doors opened for only a moment before closing again, revealing Adrian Romano calmly leading the discussion as though the morning remained perfectly ordinary. She took one step forward, but a security officer immediately raised his hand. "The meeting is private," he said politely. "Nobody enters without authorization." Grace kept her voice steady. "I understand, but I need to speak with Mr. Romano. It is important." The officer recognized her from earlier and sighed with quiet impatience. "You already reported your concern. Security has everything under control. Please return to housekeeping." Grace looked past him toward the silent hallway beyond the marble columns. The contractor was nowhere to be seen, and somehow that worried her even more. She remembered another lesson from her father. The most dangerous moment during any emergency was often the moment when everything suddenly looked normal again. She lowered her voice. "Please, just verify his company one more time. Check the maintenance request against the badge. Something does not match." Before the guard could answer, another member of the security team approached holding a tablet with a puzzled expression. "The maintenance supervisor is saying nobody from the electrical contractor was scheduled today," he said quietly. "I thought this was plumbing." The first officer frowned. It was. At least that is what the work order showed earlier. He reached for his radio, only to hear broken static instead of a clear response. Around them, the atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Calm remained, but certainty disappeared. One advisor stepped into the hallway after noticing the unusual conversation. Another guard began reviewing visitor logs. Grace stood silently, realizing that her observations were finally connecting into a picture others could also see. Within seconds, the head of security arrived and requested every camera covering the maintenance corridors. The surveillance operator divided the screens across several monitors. Employees gathered around in complete silence as recorded footage began playing backward through the morning. There was the oversized contractor entering the estate. There he was bypassing the expected maintenance route. There he was comparing a folded document with the building map. There he was calmly changing direction after the inspection doors unexpectedly closed. Nobody spoke. The room seemed to grow quieter with every passing second. The head of security paused the recording and enlarged one frame, showing the identification badge clipped to the contractor's shirt. A technician quickly searched the employee database. No matching record appeared. He searched again using the badge number. Nothing. Then he checked the delivery company itself. The logo belonged to a business that had stopped operating nearly 2 years earlier. Every person in the room slowly turned toward Grace. The rookie maid who had spent the entire morning asking uncomfortable questions had noticed what experienced professionals overlooked because they trusted routine more than observation. Adrian Romano stepped out of the conference room after hearing the sudden activity in the hallway. He looked first at the frozen surveillance image, then at the security team, and finally at Grace, whose hands still held the folded employee map she had carried since orientation. Nobody needed to explain why she was standing there. The evidence spoke for itself. For the first time that morning, Adrian did not see an inexperienced housekeeper. He saw the one person who had refused to ignore the smallest detail. And because she trusted her conscience more than her fear of being dismissed, an entire chain of unnoticed mistakes had finally come to light before it was too late. The security team moved with quiet precision after the truth became impossible to ignore. Hallways that had seemed peaceful only minutes earlier were carefully secured, while every visitor credential was verified again from the beginning. There were no raised voices and no dramatic displays, only disciplined professionals correcting the assumptions that routine had allowed them to make. The oversized contractor was located before reaching the executive wing, escorted away from restricted areas, and turned over to the proper authorities for investigation without incident. The heavy equipment case was examined and found to contain carefully prepared materials that had no legitimate connection to the maintenance request listed that morning. The mansion gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, yet nobody inside viewed the day in quite the same way again. Adrian Romano remained standing in the conference hallway after the security briefing ended, studying the surveillance images one final time before asking a simple question. Who noticed first? Every eye turned toward Grace Carter. She suddenly felt far more uncomfortable than she had while walking the service corridors alone. She was not searching for recognition. She had only followed the quiet voice reminding her that something was wrong. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks gently placed a reassuring hand on Grace's shoulder, silently encouraging her to step forward. Adrian walked across the polished marble floor until only a few feet separated them. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he looked at the folded employee map still resting inside her hand and smiled with genuine respect. You trusted what everyone else ignored, he said calmly. That cannot be taught in any security manual. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment before answering honestly. My father always told me that small details protect people long before big actions ever can. Adrian nodded as though he understood exactly what those words meant. He asked the head of security to replay the surveillance footage one final time in front of every department supervisor. Together, they watched Grace quietly following procedures, reporting her concerns, checking facts instead of making accusations, and continuing to protect others even after being dismissed more than once. No single moment made her remarkable. It was the steady sequence of ordinary decisions, each guided by integrity instead of pride, that changed the outcome. Adrian turned toward the assembled employees. Experience is valuable, he said, but experience becomes dangerous when it stops asking questions. Today, the newest employee in this house reminded every one of us that responsibility belongs to anyone willing to notice what others overlook. Then, to the complete surprise of everyone present, he removed the silver family insignia traditionally reserved for trusted household leaders and placed it into Grace's hands. Effective immediately, he announced, Grace Carter will assist our safety committee in reviewing every employee orientation program. If someone with only a few hours inside this estate can recognize what years of routine concealed, then every voice deserves to be heard. The hallway fell completely silent before warm applause slowly filled the room. Some employees smiled with quiet pride. Others lowered their heads, remembering how easily they had dismissed the young woman earlier that morning. Grace looked around the mansion that had once felt impossibly intimidating. Nothing about the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, or towering columns had changed. What changed was how the people inside looked at one another. Respect no longer followed titles, expensive suits, or years of service alone. It followed character. As sunlight poured through the great glass ceiling and illuminated the hallway where so many unnoticed choices had quietly shaped the day, everyone present carried away the same unforgettable lesson. The loudest heroes often receive the first applause, but the people who change lives forever are usually the ones who simply refuse to ignore the smallest sign that another human being might need protecting. And that day, the entire Romano estate remembered exactly what true dignity looked like.